To be very clear, the question in no way is whether I like brass. It's an incredible experience. The only real question is, which one of these do I like more? Hi, I'm Alex Ratcliffe from Board Game Co, and today I'm reviewing Brass Birmingham and Brass Lancashire. I have on the table in front of me set up Brass Birmingham primarily because I believe this one is currently the more popular, available, or whatnot of the two, but we're going to go into the game, my opinion, how it plays, general, all that, and then cover some of the differences between these two games, which one I prefer and why, understanding that my personal experience or journey with the Brass series is skipping Brass entirely when it first came out, going directly to Age of Industry by Martin Wallace. The two are mostly similar with some nuanced differences, loving Age of Industry. And then when Roxley Games came out with this new version of Brass, this delightful, amazing, incredible looking version of Brass, I picked up both of these. Then I continued to play Brass for several years, and only recently, only in the past year, have I finally started playing Brass Birmingham. And so the question for me now is, which one of these do I keep and why? Because they are too similar, and I don't play them enough for me to justify owning both. But with that, let's go into what Brass is, how the game plays, and we'll come back to that. Timestamps always down below and all of that. So, Brass. Brass is designed by Martin Wallace. This version of it is put out by Roxley Games. Art by Andrew Bosley, I believe. I could be mistaken, but I'm pretty sure the art's by Andrew Bosley. And it is a heavy Eurogame of building out your industries, your coal, your iron, your factories, building all that out as you go through the 1800s and trying to take actions in the game to just be as efficient as possible. Every single turn, you're going to be playing two cards. You're going to be playing two actions every single round from this hand of cards. This hand of cards that shows you various locations and industries on the board. You're going to take from a variety of actions, primarily building different things, building networks, taking loans, things like that. The actions are all listed on this player. We have 6 actions. We have building, which is where you take a card and you build an industry on the board. We'll come back to that shortly. We have network, which is where you can start placing your links onto the board, placing little pathways of these tiles to connect various industries, to increase your network, to increase your reach, and to score points at the end of each era. We have develop, which is where we're going to start removing some of our industry tiles on this board to allow us to get access to better industries earlier on in the game. We have sell, which is when you start flipping some of your industries in order to cash in on the sale action, selling to distant markets on the side of the board and getting a bunch of points and income generation as well. We have loan, which is where you're going to reduce your income in order to take a one-time amount of money, but money that you're going to have to continuously be paying back. You're going to be paying for that across the rest of the game, and so you want to be mindful of the fact that you will need to take loans at different points in the games, but when you take loans and how you take loans, how often you take loans, those will all determine a lot in terms of how well you do in the game. And then finally, we have Scout, which is basically a way of trading I can't do anything good with these cards in for some wild cards that you can then use later to go ahead and take actions with a bit more freedom. Those are the 6 core actions you're doing in the game, but most of them revolve around those links and those building. Most of the actions you take will be those two, and you're going to be running your entire individual player board down here. This is the main board. We have our chips, our money, we have the various resources, player aids, all that stuff, but right down here is where each player is running their own separate industry tiles. They're the businesses that they're going to be putting down on the board, from the coal, the iron, the various buildings and locations that you're going to be using to sell good, from the beer that Birmingham introduces into the game. It's one of the core differences over there, and you're trying to build these out on the terrain over here on the map. You're going to do so either by playing a specific location card, matching that location, at which point you will place down the building, paying the required costs, some of which you may need to have access to. The main 2 costs you're going to have in the game, main 3 costs really, are going to be money, paying for the buildings that way, as well as the coal and iron that you can either take from the board from other players or from the marketplace over here, and that's going to be a big part of the strategy of the game. You see, iron is pretty easy to get your hands on it. Iron you can just pick up from anywhere, either from the distant markets or either from the marketplace or directly from players' tiles, simply taking it off the board and using it for costs as needed. Now, coal on the other hand is a little trickier because you need to actually have network connections. You need to have routes to that coal in order to use it, which can be a bit problematic when you're trying to build a building in the building of nowhere before that region has been developed. So there's a degree of control as the map develops and determines what players can and can't do. Past that, you have other locations which show you an industry type instead of a location type. When you have an industry type, you're a little bit more limited in what you can do. You could go ahead and build that specific industry in any one of the locations that shows the specific picture of the industry, but you do need it to be connected to part of your network. Your network meaning the routes of tiles that you have or a location that you're present in, although that's only in phase 2 of the game, because the game is divided up into 2 phases: the canal era, and the rail era. And in the canal era, you can only have one building in each location, one industry type in each location, and so you won't have that option of placing it where you currently have a building, rather where you have a network link. That's primarily what you're doing when you build a building. You have to take the lowest industry that you have on the board at the time, which is why that develop action, which is where you can take some buildings and remove them from your board, why that action is very important. But you have to build the lowest one you can possibly build. You put it on the board, you're going to get the various income. The game tends to prioritize more income at lower buildings and more points at higher buildings, which makes sense because of the way the game will escalate. And you're trying to choose from a variety of industries to put down. Beer is going to be very helpful in terms of allowing players to sell various goods to the various distant marketplaces. Many of the goods require a beer when you take a sell action. Your crates and your buildings over here are going to primarily be just the pure sale of the action itself, flipping them over, as with these over here as well. And then the coal and the iron are going to be their own little economy of the game. You see, we have a marketplace on the side that players can buy from, paying to the board, paying to the game when they need those resources. Alternatively, players can take it on themselves to provide those resources to the game themselves for their own personal benefit. If I see there's not enough coal on the board, that players need coal to build out their rails, to build out their locations that they need, then I will go ahead and build a coal, whatever it's called, a coal thingy down on the board, and I'll go ahead and be able to sell immediately to the distant markets over here, if able, as well as alternatively just being a general source of coal for the players. That's important because as the last coal is taken from a tile, you immediately flip it over. There's no sell action for this. The consumption of the coal is what determines the flipping of the tile, which will immediately give you some points as well as some income. That's going to be true for iron as well, but with a little bit more freedom. You don't even have to be connected to the iron to go ahead and take it off from the board, giving players the opportunity to jump directly in on that. And as well, same general concept. If this is filled, if this is empty, then your first generation of the iron industry can immediately sell to the marketplaces, taking the money and flipping your tile, giving you both immediate income as well as ongoing income throughout the course of the game. Balancing everything I just told you is the entire point of this game. I've just covered 90% of the rules. There's a whole bunch of other things, and whenever you spend money, it's going to go on your token over here. That determines play order for the next round. There's going to be the 2 phases of the game. There's going to be scoring, which I didn't really cover. You're going to be scoring for all your link tiles based on how populous these various regions are. There's going to be the endgame scoring as well. You're going to be slowly moving your token around the track. When you take a loan, the exact nuances of how you move your marker back and where. There's a bunch of other nuances I've covered, but the general I have not covered. But the general idea of building industries, trying to be mindful of all the things you need, being mindful of the coal and the iron you'll need to produce, being mindful of the beer you will need to consume, being mindful of the specific randomization of the marketplaces you have to sell to, and how you're going to take advantage of that, selling to a marketplace in order to go ahead and take that extra bonus because you got there earlier than other players, being able to utilize the beer that's on the map versus having to use someone else's beer, or perhaps specifically choosing to use your own in order to flip your own tile as well. There's a whole bunch of other small details you have to be mindful of, but that's the core idea. You have your hand of cards, you have your actions. At the end of your turn, you draw up 2 new cards until that action deck runs out. You're going to go through 2 phases of the game, 2 phases where you go through the canal era and then rip down most of what you've built. All your canals are going to come off the boat. All your boats are going to come off the board. All your level 1 industries will disappear. Your level 2 industries, on the other hand, those will stick out, scoring both in the first and the second era, which means anything you can build from level 2 higher is heavily prioritized in phase 1 because you will score for that thing twice in the game. On the other hand, you might lose some of the early game income that you can get from some of the earlier tiles if you simply develop past it. These choices, the give and take of everything you're doing, is what makes Brass so appealing. And if you're used to more modern Eurogames, or the type of stuff that we see more and more coming out nowadays, the lack of complexity here might throw you off, the lack of seeming complexity. Because the core actions you take here are very simple. The core, everything you're doing here is very simple. The rulebook's like 6 pages long, and it's very image heavy at the same time. This is a very easy game to cover everything you need. But the way everything weaves together is where this game shines. The way everything works together with each other, the way the balance of the game is constantly in motion, the way you're trying to prioritize the various economies of the marketplace, the beer, the iron, the coal, the way you're choosing the locations to prioritize, where you get in first, where you're able to take a sell action first, the way the game prioritizes giving you efficiency for taking larger single sell actions, because when you take a sell action, you can sell everything at once. But the longer you wait, the more you're delaying that income. The longer you wait, the more you risk somebody else selling to the marketplace you're trying to sell to using the beer on the map that you were trying to get your hands on. Sure, you want to build another industry, but perhaps you should build another link instead because somebody else will get there first. You are heavily fighting over this board. You are heavily fighting over the first benefit access to everything, from the locations to the links to the sales. Everything in this game is a tight decision of what to do, when to do it, how to prioritize it, how to manage your turn order. And I'm heavily drifting into review territory, so let's start off with the review, starting off with ease of play. I mentioned this already. The rulebook is incredibly accessible. It's very easy to read. It's a little bit to understand the exact nuances, but they do a good job as far as generally showing you examples, going over, again, very image heavy. It's a short rulebook. This is one of these shorter, heavy rulebooks that you will end up reading. It is very easy to get the core concept of the game down on paper. A lot to understand as far as the nuances of play, but the actual core concept of the rules, the 6 actions you have, all of that is pretty easy to understand and get through. As far as player count, this is a 2 to 4 player game. I have played this at 2, 3, and 4 players, although 3 is easily my favorite player count. I find 2 has less interaction. This is a Euro game that has a decent amount of interaction as you are constantly pushing for those first access benefits, the first sale, the first location, the first everything. And so I like the extra level of interaction a 3rd player gives me, although once you start going to a 4th, I find that the 4th player does give me more interaction, but the extra playtime, the trade-off there is a little worse. For me, I would say my player count preference is 3, then 4, then 2. Choose the only one that I'd be a little bit more resistant to playing from those, though. 3 and 4 are both excellent experiences. As far as what I like, don't like, and can see others not liking, there's a lot to like with Brass. The turns are fast-paced, sort of, because your actions matter a lot, and so despite the fact that you're taking 2 actions every turn, you could simply go, oh yeah, I'm going to go ahead and build there, I'm going to build a link over there, and done. Every single action is going to cost you a card. While these cards very often matter more for the building action, past that, there's still the general economy of an action requires a card. That keeps your balance in check, it keeps your hand moving along at the same pace as others, and the actions, for the most part, are very fast-paced. Again, I say this for the most part because you could get caught up on a single action. You could get caught up on the fact that you thought something would work, or you immediately say, I'm going to build this and put down a link over here. At which point somebody inevitably says to you, that's actually the rail era. That's going to be for the second half of the game. There's not a joint canal and rail over there, so you can't do that. And suddenly the past 4 minutes you spent on other players' turn planning out your turn, you have to re-pivot or adjust. Or you try to build a card and you're like, I'm going to go ahead and build this using coal, and someone's like, it's not actually connected to the coal network just yet. So things like that, things like not properly planning or having your plans dashed can lead to a bit of a delay, but otherwise this game moves fast. 2 actions, next player, 2 actions, next player. It moves at a quick clip as long as you take those actions, the 6 simple actions you have your hands on. Simple in what they do, not simple in how you have to manage them. The tightness and timing of loans is huge in this game. Taking on loans early is very useful because of the fact that the cost to take on a loan is not as high. What I mean by that is as you move up the income tracker, as you're slowly moving up the board over here, you have different regions you're going through. And whenever you take a loan, you move back full notches on the board. You have to move back 1, 2, 3 to that zone. That is significantly more of a cost of what you're doing as opposed to earlier in the game when that exact same loan action will be 1, 2, 3. The pacing of how these spots spread out gets higher and higher as you go, making the cost of a loan higher and higher as you go. And so there's almost an incentive to cash in early, to get all that money quick and early when you're going to be able to recover from the detriment of your income faster. But it's also early. So the trade-off is there all the time. What do you do? When do you do it? When do you take those loans? When do you try to get more income? When do you balance? When are you going to be able to use that 30 money most efficiently to quickly turn it around as opposed to dealing with the consequences of the loan for the next 2 or 3 rounds because you just wanted to avoid a few spots? There's a balance around how to take loans, and it's a balance that works well. I have played this game in multiple different ways in terms of waiting till later in the game to take a bunch of loans, in terms of cashing in a bunch of stuff early. There's a whole bunch of options as far as how to navigate the loan process, and it works well. The tightening and the tightness and the timing of it are very much there. The interplay between the marketplaces is huge. The interplay between the various buildings, between the coal and the iron in particular, and then the beer as well, because the beer is an essential component. You're going to have the pre-listed beer on the board, but that will quickly be utilized by the players. And so players are going to need to start building out those beer industries. They're going to start needing to build out the beer on the board, and that's going to be another little thing you have to manage of. If I want to take a sale action, I have to use the beer. Well, someone has to have beer if I'm going to go ahead and do that, so I have to be mindful of that. At the same time, if I want to build the beer, I might need some iron on the board. Well, someone has to have iron on the board, or I could take it from the distant marketplaces, but the distant marketplace might be starting to drift out a little bit from the actual accessibility of the iron, so maybe somebody else builds the iron mine. And then all these things are working together, because when you want to build that iron mine, you need coal. How are you going to get the coal? Are you going to get a coal from the side market? Are you going to build down a coal marketplace? What are you going to actually do in this game as you make everything merge together? Some tiles prioritize points over income, some tiles prioritize income over points, some tiles prioritize the interweaving aspects of them, but everything works together. There's 5 building types. That's not a lot of building types to manage. It's not a lot of complexity in what it's doing, but the complexity comes from the interplay of all of this working together. And the connectivity of the board as well. The way everything links, the way you have to, generally they're called links, the way you have to connect points to point, and the way you have all the point scoring as well as you have these interconnected marketplaces. You'll have to have links slowly moving to the edge of the board so you can actually sell to the marketplaces. You're going to have these big central hubs of buildings where players are trying to cash in on, hey, this is a nice hub over here. Every time someone goes here, as we build this out, you're going to get chunks of points for every single industry that's on that tile. And so you're incentivized to start building out a network. You're incentivized to connect your chains of production to the hubs of commerce, not that dissimilar to what you would see and experience in real life, and it works well in the game. And it goes back to that balance of, do I build a building? Or do I simply put down a link knowing it's going to score me 6 points, and that's just as good as any building I could do right now, and it's far cheaper at the same time? I could defer that loan for another 2 turns by doing so, while still locking in perhaps less exciting points, but points nonetheless. There's a lot to consider as you build out the network of Birmingham in this game. And the card play is restrictive enough without being restrictive. You have a hand of 8 cards. You're going to be choosing which cards to discard, which cards to hold on to. The locations and the commerce and the industries shown on the cards will give you enough of a restriction that you can't simply do what you want, but not so restrictive that you can't really do what you want at the same time. I have played entire games of Brass Birmingham on a regular basis without ever touching these wild cards. Lancashire has a slightly different mechanic as far as how it implements that, but same idea. At times I've taken those wild actions because I needed the right card at the right time, but more often than not I can plan around what the game is throwing my way, and I can plan around that, feeling the restriction of what the game is doing, but not necessarily feeling overly restricted by what it's doing. And then the timing of turn order. Turn order is a little puzzle over here that when you spend money, the more you spend, the more further back you're going to go in turn order for the next turn. And so you want to be mindful of that as you go, because if you time things right, you can end up having 4 cards played in a row. You can go ahead and take your turn last in this round and then spend no money, so you go first next round, which can allow you to have a little bit more flexibility in what you're doing, or just spend less money than other players. If I build that last building, but I know that the cost of the building is less than other players, and that means I can start off my next turn with another build and then follow it up directly with a sale at the same time. I can get 4 actions in a row, and timing around the turn order is a big part of the experience, allowing for the manipulation of getting in the way of others, of getting your actions done first, of utilizing the resources on the board, of being the first to build that iron mine or the coal mine, of doing what you need to do, of choosing when to deprive yourself of your ideal action in order to manipulate yourself to the beginning of turn order in the game. And then lastly, this would not be complete without talking about the art. The art of the game. And I don't always talk about art in my reviews. Usually I figure, hey, you see the game, you either like it or you don't. But this art is absolutely stunning. The art by Andrew Bosley is incredible. There are potential complaints around the accessibility of this version versus the original. The original version is certainly more accessible from a pure seeing what's happening on the board. But I feel so much more immersed in this world. I feel like we're in the era here. I feel like we're part of this world. And it absolutely pulls me into the experience. It's beautiful to look at, and it feels like a premium game on your table. Which, by the way, is a good time to note that if you're looking at this copy, and if you buy your own copy of Brass, and if you're confused why you don't have some of the resources here, some of the resources on the table are upgraded deluxeified resources from Top Shelf Gamer. I'll throw a link in the description down below, but just occurred to me I probably should mention that before you go out and buy this game. But there is one thing I don't like, and there really is just one thing. The only real complaint I have against Brass, and it's a complaint, by the way, it's fun, because for me, for many people watching this, it'll be like, oh, he only has one complaint against Brass. And then for people who love Brass, they're going to not like my complaint, which is I do feel the variability of the experience is not a lot. I feel the core gameplay of Brass is incredible. The tightness of everything that's happening here is absolutely amazing. And the story beats you're going through are the same. Now, the way you dance from one game to the next, the way you choose to outmaneuver an opponent here or react to what your opponent's doing, that will constantly change. So it does have low variability while still maintaining the engagement I want, because I have to constantly pivot and adjust my play to what the other players are doing. I once did a full video on the nature of variability and when it bothers me, when it doesn't. And in the case of Brass, I love this game. I adore what the game is doing, and the low variability is the single strike I can have against it, while still recognizing that I love this game and it is not anywhere near enough to stop me from diving into it again and again and again. But to a certain extent, I wish that things were a drop different. One thing that, in fact, Brass Birmingham does different than Brass is it introduces a tiny drop of variability in the sense that the marketplaces around the board are a little bit more randomized, which takes a little bit away from that perfect optimization of, well, inherently, this is the best location to start in. Maybe it is, maybe it isn't. It might depend on the various marketplaces around the board, giving a drop of subtlety to how the game is being played from one game to the next. As far as I can see others not liking, a few more things in that category. First of all, it is a heavy game. This is a brain-burner experience, and to the point that when I mentioned that the game has fast turns, you may dive down into Brass and find that you're playing with people who are playing for the first time, and this is not going to be a fast game when you're playing it for the first time. There's a lot to understand, there's a lot that works together, there's a lot to think about as you take your actions. You could charge confidently forward, but if you're the kind of person who wants to understand what you're doing, your first game or two will take you a while to get the pacing, to get the understanding of the consequences of your action, and those two simple, quick actions a turn will be two actions a turn, but neither simple nor quick. And so it is a heavy game, and you have to understand what you're signing up for when you dive into a game of Brass. Additionally, I mentioned this already, but the newer design prioritizes beauty over functionality. If you take a look at the original Brass, you can go on Board Game Geek, take a look at some of the images. Everything pops in a way that you can immediately see what is happening. That might be your preference, and if it is, by the way, then the good news for you, because you can usually pick those copies up on the secondhand market pretty quickly now that most people want the new version of Brass. But if you want that accessibility, that option is available. I believe the rules changes in the new version are incredibly minor, and so you could go ahead and get that if that's your preference. And to some people, that will be their preference. For myself, I drastically prefer the immersion that this version of the game gives me, as opposed to the granted accessibility that the original one does. And then lastly, players will take things from you. Going back to the timing, going back to the fact that you're competing over everything, while this is not a war game, while this is a pure Euro in what it's doing, at the same time, because you're fighting over everything, you're fighting over the sales, you're fighting over the locations, you're fighting over the links, you are constantly being mindful of the timing of what you do so that you can most efficiently take advantage of what's happening, you will have players snatch things up from under you. That last location that has coal in an area that you need might be taken by somebody else because they chose to spend less money than you last round, and now they're going first in turn order. You only spent 5, you thought you had it locked in, and they spent nothing. They chose to simply take a loan and take a sell action just to take that spot from you. You will have the things you want taken from you. They will be more or less impactful depending on the game state. That link you want, it might cost you a few points. That location you want, it might cost you your entire strategy for the next 3 turns, and so you have to be comfortable with the fact that while this is not a aggressively interactive game, the sense and the nature of the interaction may have your plans foiled on a regular basis. As far as final thoughts on Brass, this game's a masterpiece. And it's been a masterpiece for me since I first played Age of Industry. Again, that was my first introduction. When I was first looking into these two games way back in the day, is relative, 2013, 2014, I remember looking them up, and Age of Industry was the one that was recommended as being the better version. I'm sure people will disagree. The internet's always full of opinions, but that's the one I ended up going with at the time. It made me a drop resistant to pick up Brass when they first ran. When Roxley ran that first Kickstarter showing you the 2 deluxe versions of the games, it made me a little bit more resistant to picking up the game because I was like, do I really want to pick up the deluxe-fied version of the original one, the one that's considered to be a little bit less, rated or whatnot? And I'm happy I did. I don't know the games. It's been a long time since I played Age of Industry, a very long time. And I don't remember that experience well enough to even define what the core differences are, but this version of Brass gives me all the tenseness, all the tightness, everything I liked about that experience when I first dove into it, and it does so in one of the most beautiful productions I've seen. When I first got Brass, I dove into Brass Lancashire because that's the one I knew, and I continue to love it. It was such a good experience. It was so tight, so deliciously economic and tense in the puzzle that it gives you, that it's such a meaty experience, such a rewarding experience. It's so much fun to try to sit there and pace out how are you going to build a slightly better economy, which actions or industries are you going to pursue this game, which competitive advantage are you going to try to seek. Are you going to even try to dive into Iron at all? Are you going to simply let other players provide it for you, because there's always a bit of a reason and incentive to put things on the board that players want, but it may or may not be the best thing for you. It may be the short-term appealing thing as opposed to the long-term chunk of points in the game. Brass is delightful, and then I dove into Brass Birmingham, and that was equally, well, we'll talk about it in a second, that was almost equally delightful in terms of the experiences they both provided. Slight nuance differences, but both of them incredible. For me, both Brasses, either version of the game, would be a 4.5 out of 5 for me. I love the game. The game is an absolute masterpiece. The only possible ding it has for me from being a 5 is I do like my experiences to give me a drop more variability. I like it when games feel more interactive and different every single time, and the core story beats of what happens when I play Brass do feel similar. Delightfully similar, but similar nonetheless. As far as the differences between these two games and which one I prefer, both Lancashire and Birmingham offer slightly different puzzles while utilizing the same core aspects. I would say that some of the, I'm not going to focus on every little nitpicky detail, there's some differences. Like, for instance, just give you one random example. At the end of Lancashire, you can convert every 10 money into a point, and at the end of Birmingham, you can't. There's a bunch of small things like that that I don't think significantly alter the experience you're going to have or why you would pick one over the other. What I will say is that they both offer some things that I like, and the aspects of both that I miss when I choose one over the other. Lancashire is going to have these boats, these ships. They're going to have these various ship industries on the board that don't really interact with other industries in the sense of production. Rather, they interact in just being chunks of points. You have to develop past them to get them out, but if you can do so efficiently, you can get large chunks of points for putting your ships on the board, and that is something I will miss about Lancashire. And when I said I will miss about Lancashire, that's what I mean, because for me, Brass Birmingham is the one that I prefer. The ships is the main thing I will miss about Lancashire, but most of the other aspects I prefer in Birmingham. There's a few other small things. There's going to be the aspects of the distant markets. Those distant markets are these merchantiles, I don't know what they're called, but those are going to provide a little bit of randomness to the experience that I like having. That you don't have the exact same board setup every single time. In some small way adds something else to be mindful of every time you dive into the game again. That this location might be marginally better than it was last game. This location might have absolutely nothing that it requires, completely changing how you interact with that side of the board. And so it's a small degree of variability to the experience that I appreciate. But additionally, I would say that in the original Brass over here, in Lancashire, there is something called the distant market. I'm pretty sure I've been referring to this as the distant market the whole time. It's not, this is just the marketplace. But you have a distant market where you will be able to sell to the board. Slight differences in the various tiles you have, and the way it works is you don't necessarily sell to the outer edge of the board. You can sell to some locations of the board. These ports, I'll miss that as well. I like the port aspect. But you will sell as well to the distant market, and the distant market introduces a degree of randomization where you draw a card and see what the consequences of the sale are, and that was always a piece of Brass that felt unnecessarily random in an otherwise perfect information game, and an otherwise amazing experience that you can simply feel like everything you're doing is intensely strategic, and there's no sense of push your luck, and so that always felt a bit out of place, and I won't miss that. I think those are the core aspects. There's a few other aspects, the question of, do you prefer the port tiles or the beer tiles? Functionally speaking, they are the same. Functionally speaking, both port and beer tiles are giving you a way to actually sell your goods that require another industry on the board. Practically speaking, they feel very different. I think I prefer the feel of the ports in Brass Birmingham and Brass Lancashire, but at the end of the day, the other differences that I prefer about Brass Birmingham are slightly better, and despite the feeling of it, I think that the beer and the ports ultimately end up being a very similar game consequence as far as how the various industry tiles work. These kilns over here, they feel a drop similar to the ships in the sense that they tend to prioritize a degree of development and a degree of heavily focusing on points over income. I prefer the ships, but it's not a bad thing to have either one. And so ultimately, there's small differences, very small differences, but I do prefer Birmingham at the end of the day. As far as other game recommendations, my go-to for this will be Anno 1800. That's going to be my first game recommendation. Also from Martin Wallace, and I often think of Anno 1800 as Brass Light. The games are totally different, to be very clear, yet somehow I walk away when I play Anno with a similar feeling, with a similar degree of being reliant on the industries of other players, trading with other users, building out a host of different industries. Totally different past those kind of general overlays, but a delightful game that I've really been enjoying and has consistently been rising for me. It's not necessarily the same media experience that Brass provides, but it does so in a slightly shorter, slightly more accessible playtime, while giving me a very different but similar feeling at the same time. And then past that, Food Chain Magnate. If you like heavy economic Euros, if you like a degree of being mindful of the other players' industries and how things will interact with each other on the board, Food Chain Magnate will give you that in a much more cutthroat and interactive sense than Brass does, but a game worth looking at from Spotter Games. Until next time, I'm Alex Radcliffe from Board Game Co. I hope you enjoyed this video, and as always, have a good one.